Hi, good afternoon. This is Raman. Hope you're well, and welcome back to the classes and sessions after a bit of a break, obviously because of the summer. But I think most of you would have got the invites, now for attending the sessions which have started, last week. So going on, obviously carrying on with our journey, what we are looking at doing is starting off the next unit, which is going to be contemporary issues in human resources management. And this unit, focuses on dealing with some of the key things which HR managers, face on a day-in, day-out basis within their businesses, within the organizations, or, various offices where they work when they try and introduce change within the organization. Now, one of the clear things, just before I get into the unit, it is going to be quite apt for me to look at a bit of an introduction here to explain, what are we going to do when we study this unit in a bit more detail. Now, this unit, as I mentioned to you, talks about contemporary issues, and these are, issues or opinions or topics, whichever way you call it, would actually look at defining how the day-to-day role of the HR managers actually pan out, or people working within the human resources department pans out on a daily basis. Now, the HR managers are obviously classed with some of the key responsibilities of, introducing change within the organization. Now, when they introduce change, they have to look at regulatory, they have to look at legislation, and they have to look at, some of the key legislation which are present within any geography or any particular country. Now, when this change is to be introduced, there is always, a bit of, let's put it this way, a pushback from employees sometimes within the organization, and that this pushback or these opinions, ideas, issues which crop up because of the pushback or reluctance to accept the change actually gives rise to something called issues. Now, the issues which are ongoing, and they can lead to some sort of a, let's put it this way, repercussion or some sort of an eventual outcome for the, or not a fruitful eventual outcome for the organization, would be then classed as something called contemporary issues. Now, the reason of studying this particular unit looks at understanding what are these issues. We're going to study and look into some of the issues with regards to, which the HR managers actually face. We will also look at how the issues are resolved, how these issues are challenged by the HR department. We will understand to a certain extent how these issues shape up the organizational strategy, because if there are issues and problems which are cropping up again and again in the organization, which lead to, say, loss of efficiency or productivity or loss of labor force, in terms, sometimes you get to hear the term that if there is a high turnover within the organization, that means a lot of employees end up leaving. That would mean that that particular issue needs to be identified. Contributing factors which kind of highlight or bring issue into foray need to be understood, highlighted, and they then are classed as something called contemporary issues. So we'll also look at how the approaches, and some of the regulatory framework which are used, which come to the rescue of the HR manager or the HR department in terms of, how these issues are resolved. Sometimes you'll have to dip into the legislation, regulatory framework to be able to pick out things which will help you resolve some of these issues amicably, both to the satisfaction of the organization and also the employees. And in the last learning outcome, we will kind of focus on the fact that how some of these issues actually shape the organizational performance. Why do they crop up? Once they crop up, or once they, kind of are identified as issues, how does HR intervene to solve these issues? And then, there could be a range of issues that we will look at, but the idea would be how they are essentially solved and what kind of challenges which, the HR managers face in terms of resolving some of these issues as and when, they are identified within the organization. So the unit is an interesting unit, keeping in mind, because those learners who are looking at understanding HR in particular it's not always merry-go-round, or it's not always very easy going within the organization. A lot of managers, when they are in the managerial position, are actually tasked with problems or issues which they need to resolve. And when we look at in particular issues which the HR department in particular faces, people who work within the human resources department, whether it's development, training, recruitment, selection, dealing with unions, or when they look at globalization, diversity of workforce, then these issues do crop up, and how do the HR managers actually end up resolving it is what we will look at within this particular module or unit for the course. So what I've done is, in order to kick this unit off, or obviously start the discussion on this unit, what we're looking at is we're going to go through some of the slides which are put together. In terms of addressing all the tasks 1.1, 1.2, and the learning outcome 1, what I've done is I've put together a number of slides, and they are in the context of UK. Some of the slides which I put forward are in the context of UK first, to understand from our point of view. And then if I have to apply it globally, I've applied it globally to, say, the US side of the organization, or the geography in particular. And that would mean that, it will give you a perspective internationally of how some of these issues crop up in different geographies or different parts of the world, and how HR managers then kind of address it. So let's look at getting into going through some of these slides. And the idea would be, if you have any questions, just feel free to obviously type those questions through the chat room, and I will address them as we go along into this session. So looking at going through a couple of slides, and then after that, as usual, as always, after the session, I'm going to try and send you the copy of this presentation. This will also be available on the PLE, and at some stage, along with the presentation, you will also get a handout which will kind of allow you to study in a bit more detail and crystallize some of the concepts which are important to understand the contemporary issues and the impact that this has on the organization and the management of human resources. So let's look at a few slides. Now, briefly looking at, in terms of how do you define contemporary issue? Contemporary issue would be defined as an idea, event, opinion, topic, given the subject that this is an issue which basically comes up and is relevant for present day. That means it is something which is going to be affecting efficiency, productivity, day-to-day working of the human resources in the organization, and that is why this issue is going to be picked up by the HR and then discussed in order to resolve this. Now, there's an interesting article that I picked up on Emerald, which is the e-library, and that is where this was something which was interesting to note, is that when you look at people working within the organization, they look at a couple of things today. You look at working within the organization wherein you get a good amount of, let's put it this way, you get dignity, and you are proud to do the work, and you enjoy the work that you do. So in order to look at how do we look at dignity at work and dignity in work is something which are the two dimensions which most employees actually relate to. And we look at that, what it tends to do is it can be identified either presence or absence of subjectively experienced and objectively comparable criteria. That means when you take up a job or a particular job role, what you always do is you compare subjectively that job role with your experience, and then objectively you compare what emoluments or rewards in terms of salary, wages that you get which are comparable, and that is where you do the comparison with similar roles within the organization or outside the organization. So when we look at the two dimensions of dignity within work and dignity at work, you look at some of these things which are classified, and that at stage would then be looking at issues which would crop up and then become contemporary issues or issues on the present day. Now, job autonomy, satisfaction, meaningful work, respect, learning, looking at some of these things, they all kind of help you get dignity while you're working within an organization. So you are expecting that you get meaningful work is given to you by your boss or your manager, which is meaningful. You get respect, you're treated respectfully within the organization, and while you're working within the organization or a business, you're getting to learn, and there is a developmental side of things. That means you're developing your career and your skills while working within the organization. And when we look at objectively comparing that, what you're looking at is in return when you put in the efforts and you work for the organization, you are basically able to get rewards. You get job security, and to a certain extent, you get a voice which is heard, and the opinions that you put forward or the suggestions or feedback that you put forward is actually valued by your employer. So when we look at some of the contemporary issues, which HR management actually, or the human resources, actually face, what we are looking at basically is identifying the factors which affect everyday activity. That is what I mentioned earlier, day-to-day operations, of the organization, and they can be both internal and external. So sometimes you will see that there are factors which affect the workforce within a company, business, organization, and some of these factors could be internal, some of these factors could be external. Now, in some cases, what we do get to see is that some organizations which are nimble, lean and mean, and they're able to pick up some of these issues and changes to look at, identifying them, and then they are able to kind of tweak some of these issues, address these issues to better the performance, which then contributes to higher productivity within the organization. Now, looking at, having said contemporary and having discussed issues, let's look at what are the issues. What could be these issues? Now, some of the common factors and issues which can affect, working of individuals in the organization could be legislation. There could be technological advances. It could be economic conditions. It could be the work-life balance. Some of the issues are things like sexual harassment. That means, you are not treated fairly within the organization, and this is a case in point wherein we've seen a lot of cases in the last few weeks and months which have been brought across, wherein, say for example, the chief executive of Uber had to step down because of the claims of sexual harassment. We've seen Mark Hurd, who was the chief executive of the HP, Hewlett Packard, had to step down because of the issues of sexual harassment. So we will discuss some of these issues, and these are factors which kind of affect the working of human resources within the organization. Now, having understood a bit of an overview, what we want to be able to do now is look at some of the learning objectives that we want to understand, deal with by looking at some of the slides, so that will help us understand the unit, the contemporary issues in human resources management. Now, one of the key things that you see with HR is that you're currently dealing with increasing complexity of diversity of workforce. That means you have people because of immigration, because of people and organizations having businesses in different countries, different locations. There's a diversity which is now increasing within the workforce, and that kind of creates a very dynamic environment and can lead to the creation of certain issues which are then classified as contemporary issues. We will also look at what is the role of the manager and how it is central to ensuring that management is able to balance this diversity when they manage the workforce. We'll also look at some of the key things like why effective management of diversity is important, but also at the same time, why is this needing to be managed both ethically and from a business perspective. And what we'll also look at is we'll also discuss, what is the perception, and why do employees then look at developing this perception that I'm not being treated fairly or I've been treated unfairly, and what are the key signals that the HR needs to look at before it kind of blows up into an issue, or they need to identify at a bud stage in terms of what these issues are being created. So we look at understanding some of the perceptions and the use of schemas, which is basically looking at situations of why this unfair treatment actually comes into practice or comes into being within the organization. And then the second part is basically at we being able to identify, as HR managers, we being able to identify these issues, and then these issues which arise because of diversity, technology, changes in technological advancement, economic conditions, or the legislation. How do we then manage some of them quite effectively to move the organization forward and not let these issues affect the workforce within the organization. Now, I put together a few slides just to define briefly these issues, and the idea would be to try and make you understand from a UK perspective that why some of these issues are identified very clearly when we look at managing diversity in terms of workforce within an organization. Now, one of the key things over the years which has happened is that legislation has been introduced, and that legislation has meant that every company has now to kind of, conform to this human resources legislation which has been put in place. And some of these legislations which impact workforce and policies which the HR department develops for the workforce have to be looked at into detail. So as an HR manager, you need to have the knowledge, you need to have the whereabouts to be able to understand the implication of this legislation and then apply that legislation to create regulatory framework or policies or procedures within the organization. So what we look at is, in the context of UK, there is something called the Recovery Act of 2000. There's a mental health care reform bill which was passed in 2010, and this promised that if say for example you fall ill, statutory building in of the holidays, things which require you to be able to say for example take time off work to be able to recover and then join back the job rather than the employer having to kind of shunt you out or make you redundant, was introduced in the Recovery Act bill which was passed in 2010. And that basically says that if your adverse health has say some repercussions on the business, you're not able to attend, not able to work or execute your roles and responsibilities, then there is a provision which is required in the business for them to be able to cover some of these costs. So the liability insurance wherein the workers can be compensated because of poor health or statutory sick leave and things like that from this particular legislation. Now, there is much more to this legislation, and you could look at this in a bit of a handout that I will send along with the presentation. But on the slides, what we're looking at is just having an understanding of a macro overview of how these issues or these factors actually are classified as contemporary issues. So technological advantages or advances basically, not advantages, but I beg your pardon. Technological advances can also impact, working of an employee within the organization. And these could be things which sometimes when you look at, and we take that for granted. Now, most organizations do not change IT, for example, for a number of years. But when they do change IT infrastructure, what the company needs to do is provide proper training and development for the employees to be able to adapt to that new technology or that particular environment. So when I mention the word technological advances, what we basically mean is that the changes which are happening in technology and the employees which are required to keep pace with those changes, there's a bit of a gap there. And at this moment, it is the responsibility of the HR department to initiate and then obviously organize training and development so that each and every employee within the organization is able to adapt favorably to those changes which are happening because of the organization replacing old equipment or bringing in new technology to make the workforce more effective and more productive. So sometimes you will see that technology has a positive aspect wherein it is helping to revolutionize say for example inventory management, just-in-time ordering, supply chain management, data which can be crunched because of everything is digitized. These are the benefits of technology. Looking at revolutionizing the way businesses now do business or look at transactions and are able to kind of support customers and consumers with information. So it is helping businesses save money, but to a certain extent, it does not mean that there could be a bit of discrimination or with employees which do not have good understanding of IT. People who are, senior people or senior people working within the organization which are not good with IT should not be discriminated. And in some cases, the HR department is to put together training and development to be able to ensure that this does not become a contemporary issue. One of the other things that we look at is economic conditions. Sometimes you will see that some of the big factors which contribute towards a bit of a decline or, a slowdown in the organizational activity could be because of economic conditions. And this economic condition is an external factor. The reason why it's an external factor is that it will not just affect your business or one particular organization, it can affect all the organizations because this is to do with, a factor which is beyond the control of the company, business or organization. And this external factor not only affects sometimes the talent pool, you will see that if the particular segment or industry is going, a lot of people will switch jobs or go to that particular sector because they feel that there is an opportunity that they need to take care of, rather take advantage of, so that they are able to get onto the better side of earning wages or potential. Now, in those cases, sometimes you will see that when the economic conditions are improving, the labor, or the workforce, normally you tend to see as an HR manager a bit of a high turnover because employees then get options within the market. They are able to seek out more lucrative jobs, and that is where the HR department needs to then identify this beforehand so that they can plan accordingly to look at say, for example, giving wage rise. Sometimes you see that organizations, if you look at the last financial crisis that we've had, most public sector employees have not had any rise in wages. Or if the rise in wage was there and the salaries were there, it was very minimal. It was outstripping the rate of inflation in most economies. So they had a 1% rise or a 2% rise at max. Now this bar has been taken off. Now what that meant was that because of economic conditions which were affecting the business, a lot of companies in the private sector were able to make employees redundant. But in the public sector, rather than having large-scale redundancies, the government kind of, in some cases, capped that there will be no wage increases for the next 2, 3, 4 years. And now with the cap being lifted, what that would mean is that with the economic conditions improving, some of these things HR has to proactively look at to be able to, now look at wage rises and increases in order to retain the best talent within the organization. One of the key things that we look at with technology coming in is that work-life balance. Now, because if you look at 20 years back, 2 years, 2 decades, 3 decades back, when you look at, there were not many advancements in technology from a point of view of telecommunication when you look at. Now today people are able to get hold of people on mobile, tablet, emails and things like that. But if you look at 2, 3, 4 decades back in the 1990s, there was nothing called an email, there was nothing called a mobile phone. And the good old ways of work-life balance was there, that people used to work either in shifts, 8 hours, 9-hour shifts, whatever it is. But when you went back home, that typically meant that whatever work was not done had to be picked up the next day. So in today's context, in modern days context, what we're looking at is a lot of people are working in order to make the ends meet. And sometimes what you do see is that some companies, when we look at the likes of the millennial companies or businesses like Facebook, LinkedIn, you look at Google, they have introduced techniques or flexible working essentially for employees within the organization, because what they want to do is because work never stops. So what they want the employees to be able to do is have a bit of a work-life balance, and that balance allows them, time to be able to spend with family, friends and things like that. But at the same time, they want productivity from the employee. And in those cases, in order to promote this concept, what they've done is they've introduced flexible working techniques which allow workers to, work in shifts. As long as the work is done, the companies are okay, and they're able to balance their work life with the family life and not give up career. So in the olden days, if you look at women in particular, if they had, taken maternity leave, it was almost certain that the person would be obviously, made redundant from the organization, and the organization will end up hiring somebody else. But now with the changes in legislation, like in countries like UK, the developed countries, what they've done is they've allowed now paternity leave, and that could be a maximum of 52 weeks. That means the father and the mother both can take a time off from their jobs, and that would mean that the organization cannot make the employees redundant, which allows them to have a bit of a work-life balance between working and taking turns to look after the young baby or the young born, but at the same time enjoy the benefits of flexible working and also the paternity leave. This particular topic of sexual harassment is a very big issue in some organizations, and what it basically means is that if there is an unwanted act of sexual nature, which means it can affect the individual performance, then it is likely that it undermines the worker's ability to be able to perform jobs. And this is normally seen in organizations wherein you get harassed because of verbal abuse or physical abuse, and this is now considered very seriously in all organizations at the topmost level. So if there is a complaint, or if there is an issue which arises because of say, for example, because of issues which can be brought across in terms of a complaint by a female worker within the organization, then it immediately leads to a disciplinary action. And in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen top executives having to resign from the position or from the company because these charges, are serious charges, and that means that it affects or undermines the working of women in general within the organization, and that is where this is an ongoing issue, for which the HR has now in most organizations created policies. And you have, say for example, I'm wanting to use a particular word, which basically says there are certain avenues and channels through which employees can actually report cases of this, which can be independently investigated. And if it is found to be valid, then the employees are, dismissed from the organization, and they can, be fired from the organization, and even lead to criminal offenses, which means can lead to jail and other bits. When we look at the issue of sexual harassment within the organization. Now, some of the other slides that I'm going to look at would be, talking about in detail why these contemporary issues arise, and these slides are important because these will give us information into understanding why is such that these issues which arise, some of them can be classed as internal, some could be classed as external, but why in general how these issues arrive can be then resolved and picked up by the HR when we look at the issues or factors actually affecting the employee and the workforce within the organization. Now, one of the things that we looked at is that because the companies are now global, some of the businesses go across geographies. There is an increasing diversity of workforce which is coming across, and that also is changing the working environment for a lot of companies, businesses, organizations across the globe. Now, diversity could have different meanings. Diversity could be dissimilarities or differences between people in terms of their age, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, their backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. It could be their capabilities and disabilities. If we look at a particular organization and we class this onto a particular pie chart, what we do see is that the sources of diversity at workplace can come from these different factors that I've listed in the previous slide. It's just that I've drawn it out on a pie chart here. So you could have the diversity coming into the organization because of age group. That means you have some workers at lower age, 20, 25. You have people who are at 40, 45, and things like that. So male, female, race, ethnicity, religion, they all are going to be contributing to diversity at workplace. Now, when you have diversity at workplace, what does that mean? Diversity at workplace means that there are, what you have to do is you have to have policies and procedures in place which do not discriminate on the basis of, this diversity. That means you cannot say that I'm going to favor employees of such and such age or such and such religion or background to be able to look at, say, for example, when it comes for opportunities for promotion. So in order to make the process effectively work and make it crystal clear, what most HR departments end up doing is they create policies like equality and diversity policy. And that policy basically details out how the organization treats the different types, of employees within the organization, which could be, they disregard things like race, religion, age, ethnicity, and sexual orientation and background. And that cannot be used as a factor to discriminate or, give additional favors to an employee when it comes to positions or when it comes to, for example, working within the organization, not positions, but working within the organization. Now, sometimes you will see that, diversity concerns come across and they come across, as invisible barriers. That means these concerns are there, but they are invisible and people don't, talk about it. They shy actually away from talking about it. And that means sometimes you will see some of these issues in particular related to women, get left out. So we hear the terms like, there are not many very people, not many very women essentially who are amongst the top within the companies in terms of representation on the board, or when we look at women leading companies, as chief executives or as senior, officers, which is say CXO officers, Chief HR, Chief Financial Officer, things like that. And that means that sometimes you get to hear the terms that, women are not fit for that job, or, they cannot take up that job because it's a demanding job. And those are issues which are basically concerns. They are concerns because they tend to be, invisible in some situations, and they are not openly talked about. But these are concerns which arise when we look at, say, for example, women not being promoted into top positions within, large companies. Now, when we look at diversity, because issues or concerns related to diversity, what we look at is, just as an example, that, the median age in the United States is going to be 37 years by 2030, and 20% of the population will be over 65. Now, what that means is that there are some federal age, discrimination laws, which were introduced in 1964 and 7, and that basically meant that, when you hire employees within the organization, you cannot put an age down saying that you want an employee. Say, for example, you're hiring a receptionist, you're hiring somebody who's in administration. You cannot say that I want somebody who's less than 20 years or less than 25 years in age. So age cannot be put across on, job adverts. And that if you put across saying that you want this and this, you want somebody to apply from this background, this age, this experience, then you are looking at discriminating on the basis of, diversity. Now, there are major, equal employment laws which have been put into place in the US. And when I look at the similar laws are being put into other places in the UK, and these laws over the years have been, passed by the Parliament, or, there's a bill which has been passed in the Parliament, and they have now been set into stone. Now, just to give you an example, this is a table of the US laws, which basically talks about equal employment opportunities. And these laws, look at the Equal Pay Act, they look at the Civil Rights Act, they look at the Age Discrimination or Employment Act, Pregnancy Discrimination Act, Disabilities Act, Civil Rights Act, and, some of the other laws which are Family and Medical Leave Act. Now, over the years, what you have to do is, depending on when we go to the assignment brief, and when you look at starting to attempt, the tasks, what you have to look at is you have to identify some of the contemporary issues. And when you identify these contemporary issues, you have to pick up a particular country and apply those laws for that particular country. So in this case, on the slide, I put together laws which are primarily US-centric, but you could look at laws which are within your country, and they could be related to, the human resources in general. Most countries will have laws on pay, will have laws on equality and diversity, discrimination. They will have, something on the Disabilities Act, and those laws, essentially would be the ones that you have to look at, to bring across in your assignment, specifically when we discuss contemporary issues. So some of the slides now detail out into, why these, laws were important and why they were introduced, because they did away with the concept of, discrimination happening because of race, religion, ethnicity, orientation and things like that, or your social economic background. Now, when we look at some of the key things, with regards to understanding, so I'm not going to go through all the slides like socioeconomic, we're looking at basically religion. So these are all individual parts of, what does that mean? So what do you mean by workforce diversity? And there is no such clause which can be included in the job application form of the advert where it says you need to describe your sexual orientation. Now, if you're trying to do that, then what does it mean? That means the Employment and Workplace Discrimination Act comes into place. You have a provision wherein you could have, the same-sex partner benefits being applied to a job when the employment contracts are drawn up. So those are things which you cannot discriminate against, and you have to be very clear that if say, for example, an organization clearly lists out in their recruitment and selection policy that they are not going to discriminate against this and this, then that needs to be adhered to and implemented when the actual, recruitment and selection process happens within the organization. Now, one of the key things that we look at is, people or managers have to basically look at managing these issues within the organization. Now, how can managers look at managing these issues? They look at managing these diversity issues in particular by looking at dipping into legislation, regulation, and also by looking at dipping into something called policies or regulatory framework which have been created or adapted into the organization. Now, typically, what you look at is that there is a commitment which needs to come across from the topmost person in the organization, which is the top management, and that commitment basically needs to kind of then be driven down into each and every department and each and every department of the organization. Now, some of the clear bits that we look at, from a point of view of managerial roles, what we look at is, if you look at managerial roles and the effective management of the diversity policy within an organization, what you do get to see is that sometimes you will see the HR managers play a very interpersonal role. Sometimes they play an informational role, and sometimes they play a decisional role. So when we look at interpersonal roles, there could be specific roles within that, wherein the person might come in and be a figurehead, leader, liaison, do a bit of a cooperation and liaising between the two parties, and that effectively means that sometimes you have to assume these roles to be able to solve some of these issues. Now, if you have issues which are being faced at the employee level, and the issue being faced at the employee level, both of them are managers, equals within a particular department, then your role in that case might not be the role of being a decision maker, but your role might be more of, if you are coming in to resolve that situation, might be that you will have an interpersonal chat with both the candidates. You will decide that who is at fault or who is not at fault, who's not being, who's willing to budge and who's not willing to budge. And in this case, you bit of liaising or coordination between the people who have had this misunderstanding, and then try and resolve the issue. So depending on the situation, sometimes you will see that the HR managers will be required to assume some of these roles, which are going to be roles to try and solve a particular problem within an organization which arises because of diversity of the workforce. Now, let's look at one or two other quick points with regards to, how does, say, for example, how do managers essentially look at, dealing with these contemporary issues or challenges which they face because of diversity. Now, there are lots of ways through which managers can actually manage diversity. One of the ways through which you can manage diversity would be to ensure that you have equal representation in the top management or the committee structure of the organization. If there is equal let's put it this way, if there is an equal representation of the diversity of the workforce of the organization at the top management level, then that helps to basically, clearly manage diversity issues in the organization. Sometimes you will see that, the HR department would tend to drive a lot of awareness campaigns, to basically make the other employees more aware of the cultural nuances or, the diversity of workforce which is working in the same department, to be made aware of their, requirements while understanding and working together. So in order to ensure that, the diversity within the organization, they are aware of that there are people coming in working from diverse backgrounds, have different knowledge, different objectives. If that is available, then to a certain extent, some of these issues can be controlled and resolved. The other thing that most managers do is they encourage flexibility. That means if you look at an organization wherein you have two managers with the same set of experience, same set of qualifications, what the organization would tend to then do is look at managing them with a flexible approach, that if they run two shifts, it could be one manager working in one shift, the other manager working in the other shift. It could be that in some cases they end up giving the two managers different responsibility. They break the responsibility up so that there is no overlap. And that means that, they are able to resolve some of these issues which could arise because of, diversity. Now, some of the other things that you look at is that when you look at managing diversity, sometimes, good managers look at empowering their employees with additional responsibility and, the responsibility to be able to make decisions. Sometimes you can manage diversity or issues which arise because of diversity by looking at rewarding employees. You can look at providing training, and you can also look at, the concept of coaching and mentoring, which would mean that, people who are not aware of the cultural nuances or, differences between people working in the same organization, same department, can be put together through a training route, or encourage the concept of, being trained or understanding the culture, so that these issues then could be, avoided. Now, sometimes you will see that a lot of organizations, big organizations like IBM, Google, what they would do is, in order to highlight that they are consisting of, different types of people, what they tend to do is that they also do something called the diversity management programs. So what they do is they end up doing a promotion of, their own policies and procedures, which kind of, make people aware of the diversity within the organization. And this then tends to avoid some of the discussions which can happen or can lead to conflicts, because people and employees have been made aware of the, diverse culture of the organization, the type of diverse working force within the organization. Now, the issue of sexual harassment, we can look at from different aspects. Sometimes you see that, when we look at sexual harassments, this particular case would be that, you're asking an employee to do a particular type of work, which in turn, is not required to be done, but you're asking for sexual favors in exchange for work or reward that could be given. And those then fall into the remit of something called the sexual harassment. Hostile working environment could also come within the same factors and would be classed as, factors which are, promoting or issues which would arise because of sexual harassment. Now here, the policy which the HR department or managers normally adopt is that they look at a fair and a clear communication process. They look at making sure that some of these things are made aware to the employees in terms of what is right, what is not right, to be able to approach female employees within the organization, and how they need to kind of look at issues if there is something of this nature which comes up in the organization, or there's a complaint which has been done within the organization because of unfair treatment, or use of unfair treatment, and that leads to basically the cases or charges of sexual harassment. Now, if you have to move quickly and obviously look at addressing them, what you have to do is you have to identify when it happened, where it happened, and a corrective action has to be taken in place. In most cases, you will see that there's a lot of training, education, which is provided when you join an organization as a new employee, because they have seen or witnessed these issues in the past, and because this has happened, then the organization has developed a training or a development program to be put in place, and when new employees join, they are taken through that program, so they are clearly aware of these issues which could arise, and if it arises, then how they can be actually resolved. So let's look at summarizing. So what we have covered today in today's session in general is looking at understanding what are contemporary issues, the types of contemporary issues, and how, if these issues arise, are dealt with by HR managers, and how some of these issues can pose challenges or significant challenges to people working within the human resources department in the organization. And when you have to look at, as an HR manager, resolving some of these issues, what you look at is you dip into your own policies and procedures, take help of that. You look at dipping into legislation. You look at the regulatory framework, and the idea there is to basically understanding how this framework can help resolve some of these issues which most employees or organizations do face within the modern day context today when they work within organizations. So with this, I'm going to kind of bring this session to an end. And as always, I'm going to, if you have any questions, please ask me now. If not, then I'm going to send you a bit of a handout along with the Learning Outcome 1 presentation, which will help you understand what are contemporary issues, a bit more reading into that, and then how they impact the productivity and efficiency within the organization, and how human resources management or people working within HR department end up dealing with these issues if they do crop up or arise within the organization. Is that okay? Yeah, good stuff. So I will catch up with you next week, and we'll continue our journey on covering Learning Outcome 2. Up until then, do a bit of a reading with regards to the ebook which has been uploaded onto Moodle, and it basically talks about contemporary issues, and the type of contemporary issues that we've discussed today. And if you have any questions, queries, please come back to me on email, and I'll come back to you pretty much straight away. Okay, thanks very much, and goodbye.